The widow jerked her hand away before the county official could lead her another step. The movement was sharp enough to turn heads across the crowded hall. Every voice seemed to stop at once. "Don't touch me. You signed the debt papers. I signed to bury my husband, and now the bank wants payment." People shifted in their seats. Boots scraped the floor. Nobody looked comfortable, but nobody looked away either. The widow stood alone on the platform. Her black dress was worn thin at the sleeves. Her eyes looked tired, though not weak. Months had passed since her husband had been found dead inside a dry well beyond their property line. The questions never stopped. Neither did the bills. A man near the back shook his head. "This ain't right." "Then you bid," another man answered. "You bid, not me." The official cleared his throat. "This auction concerns labor contracts." A woman in the crowd laughed bitterly. "That's what they call it." Nobody argued with her. Everyone knew what happened when debts swallowed a family. The paperwork used clean words. The reality felt dirtier. The old ranch families occupied the front rows. Their faces stayed still. Their hands rested on polished canes and belt buckles. They watched the widow the same way they watched cattle sales. Near the wall stood the sheriff, silent, arms folded, eyes fixed ahead. The widow noticed him. "You won't say anything." The sheriff did not answer. "You never do." His jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. The official unfolded another sheet. "Outstanding debt remains unpaid. My husband is dead. The debt remains. My home is gone. The debt remains." For a moment she looked as if she might step off the platform and walk away. Then she saw the armed deputy by the door. The choice disappeared. The official raised his voice. "Opening bid." Nothing happened. Silence spread across the room. 1 second. 5. 10. The widow felt heat climbing into her face. No bids. Not even from the men who had whispered about her for months. Someone coughed. Someone looked down. A chair creaked. The silence hurt worse than mockery. Then a voice broke it. 50. Heads turned. A rancher sat 3 rows back. Ely. He was not old. Not young either. Broad shoulders. Dust on his coat. A face that rarely showed emotion. The official nodded. 50 offered. The room stirred immediately. A ranch owner in the front row frowned. "You serious?" Ellie said nothing. Another man lifted a hand. 60. The widow stared at the floor. The bidding had started. She hated that feeling. Not fear, not shame. Something colder, as if pieces of her life were being counted and measured by strangers. 70. Ellie again. 80. 90. 100. The numbers climbed, murmurs followed. "Why's he doing this?" "No idea. He barely hires anyone. Maybe he knows something." The widow wished they would stop talking about her as if she were absent. The official pointed. 120. A rancher near the aisle shrugged. 130. Ellie raised his hand without hesitation. 150. The room quieted. The other bidder lowered his eyes. He was finished. The official waited. No further bids. Nobody spoke. The widow could hear her own breathing. No further bids. Still nothing. The official struck the table. "Sold." The sound echoed harder than it should have. People immediately began whispering. The widow stepped down from the platform. Ely approached. Neither smiled. Neither offered a greeting. For a long moment they simply stood there. Then she spoke first. "Why me? Because nobody else would." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I got." She stared at him. His face never changed. "You expect gratitude?" "No." "You expect obedience?" "No." "Then what do you want?" "Work." "That's all?" "That's all." She almost laughed, not because it was funny, because she did not believe him. Around them, people continued watching. An old woman approached the widow. "Be careful." "I always am." "Not careful enough." The woman glanced toward the sheriff, then she walked away. The sheriff finally moved from the wall. He stopped beside Eli, taking a risk. Ellie nodded. "Maybe." The sheriff looked at the widow. "Good luck," she answered immediately. "Where was that luck when my husband died?" The sheriff had no reply. He walked away. Outside, the crowd spilled into the street. Whispers followed them. "She'll be back within a week. Maybe less." Poor thing, the widow hated that phrase most of all. Poor thing, as if grief had turned her into an object. Ellie guided a wagon toward the road. You coming? She hesitated, then climbed aboard. The town slowly disappeared behind them. Neither spoke for a long time. Fields rolled past, broken fences, empty pastures, dust drifting across the road. Finally, Eli glanced her way. You can leave if you want. And go where? He had no answer. She looked ahead. The image of the dry well returned again. Her husband's boots, the rope, the questions nobody solved. She swallowed hard. You knew him? A little. Did you like him? Yes. Did you believe what they said? No. That surprised her. She studied him. Why? Because some stories sound rehearsed. The wagon continued forward. For the first time all day, she felt something besides anger. Not trust, not comfort, just curiosity. The road curved around a line of aging trees. A distant ranch appeared beyond them. Largered, Kelly pulled the reins and slowed the horses. The wagon rolled to a stop. Ahead stood a wooden gate. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. Neither spoke. The ranch waited beyond the fence in complete silence. The ranch waited beyond the fence in complete silence. Eli climbed down from the wagon and pushed the wooden gate open. Its hinges groaned softly. The widow stayed where she was. Her hands remained folded in her lap. She did not move. If this is charity, I don't want it. Good. Good? I wasn't offering charity. She looked at him for a long moment. Then what am I doing here? Working. That's all. That's all. She stepped down from the wagon at last, though she did not believe him. The gate stood open behind them like a line she could still cross back over. Part of her wanted to. The other part knew there was nowhere left to go. They walked into the ranch yard. The place was larger than she expected, but it carried the feeling of something slowly running out of strength. Several corrals stood empty. Fence rails leaned sideways. A water trough sat half dry beneath a layer of dust. She counted cattle in the distance, not many. Far fewer than a ranch that size should have carried. You lose stock? Yes. How many? Enough. Disease? Some.
You're avoiding the question.
Eli kept walking. The answer told her enough. Money was disappearing here too. Near a barn, 2 workers loaded supplies onto a wagon. They glanced toward Eli, then toward the widow. One shook his head, the other looked away. Leaving? She asked. Yes, Eli said. Why? They found better work. Neither worker looked convinced. One climbed onto the wagon. Take care, Eli. You too. The wagon rolled away. The widow watched until it vanished down the road. Looks like everybody leaves. Ellie did not answer. That silence followed them toward the house. The building sat at the center of the property. Strong beams, wide porch, weathered boards. It should have felt welcoming. Instead, it felt abandoned in ways that had nothing to do with empty rooms. The front door opened before they reached it. A small girl stood there. She looked no older than 10, thin shoulders, dark eyes, quiet. She stared directly at the widow. Neither spoke. Finally, Eli nodded. Ruth. The girl looked at him, then back at the widow. Who's she? A worker. Ruth kept staring. The widow had seen that look before. Children gave it when they were trying to decide whether someone would disappear. Inside, the house felt colder than the afternoon outside. Not because of temperature, because nobody seemed to live fully inside it anymore. A rocking chair sat near a window. It faced outward. No dust covered it. No one used it, the widow noticed immediately. Who sits there? Nobody answered. Ruth walked away first. Eli removed his hat. My wife used to. The widow looked back toward the chair. Used to. Not sits. Used to. When did she die? Eli paused. Years ago. How? Another pause. She didn't. What does that mean? It means she didn't die. Then where is she? I don't know. The room seemed even quieter after that. She followed him into the kitchen. A cupboard door hung crooked. Several shelves were nearly empty. The signs of struggle appeared everywhere once she noticed them, not poverty. Exhaustion, the kind that settled into walls. Ruth sat at the table without speaking. The widow unpacked a few supplies from the wagon. The girl watched every movement, every step, every glance. Finally, Ruth spoke. "Are you staying? I don't know. Nobody stays." The widow looked at her. "Who left?" "Everybody." "Ruth." Ellie's voice was calm but firm. The girl lowered her eyes. Nobody said another word. As evening settled over the ranch, dinner was placed on the table. Beans, bread, a little meat, just enough for 3 people. They sat together. Nobody spoke. The widow thought silence in the auction hall had been uncomfortable. This felt worse. The silence here had history. Every chair seemed occupied by someone missing. Every corner felt filled with things nobody discussed. She tried once. "How long has it been since your wife left?" Ellie chewed slowly. "A while." "That doesn't answer anything." "No. Do you ever look for her?" "Yes." "Find anything?" "No." The conversation died again. Ruth stared at her plate. Ely stared at the table. The widow stared around the room. That was when she noticed the photograph. It sat on a shelf near the wall. A family portrait. Part of it was burned black, not by accident. The damage covered one section almost completely. She stood after dinner and walked toward it. "What's this?" Neither answered. She lifted the frame. A man, a woman, a child, most of one figure destroyed by fire. The burn marks looked deliberate. "Who burned it?" Still no answer. She turned toward Eli. His face hardened instantly. "Put it back." "Why?" "Just put it back. What are you hiding?" "Nothing." She almost laughed. The answer sounded exactly like a lie. The room fell silent again, heavy, unmoving. Then Ruth climbed down from her chair. The little girl walked across the room without speaking. She reached for the photograph. For a second, Eli looked ready to stop her. But he didn't. Her eyes never left the damaged faces, as though the missing pieces still remembered everything inside them. Ruth carefully lifted the burned frame from the widow's hands. Then, just as quietly, she placed it back into them. Ruth carefully lifted the burned frame from the widow's hands. Then, just as quietly, she placed it back into them. The widow looked down at the photograph. The glass was scratched. Smoke stains covered the edges. One figure remained almost completely erased beneath black burnt marks. She traced the damaged shape with her thumb. "Who's missing?" "Nobody." The answer came from Eli. She looked up. "That's a lie." "Leave it alone." "Why?" "Because I said so. That isn't good enough." Ellie stepped closer. For the first time since she had met him, real anger showed on his face. "I said leave it alone." The widow stared back. Neither moved. Neither looked away. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "Stop." Both adults turned toward her. The girl looked frightened. Not of the argument, of the photograph itself. She climbed down from the chair and walked out of the room without another word. The widow watched her disappear down the hallway. Then she set the frame back on the shelf. "Fine." Ellie nodded once. But neither of them believed the conversation was over. The next morning arrived with work. The widow preferred that. Work left less room for memories. She spent hours repairing fences and carrying feed. The ranch was larger than she first thought, but signs of trouble appeared everywhere. Empty pens stood where animals should have been. Broken equipment sat untouched. Several buildings needed repairs nobody seemed interested in making. By midday, she found herself working beside 2 ranch hands near a storage shed. Older men, quiet men, the kind who noticed more than they said. At first, they spoke only about cattle and weather. Then one of them glanced toward the house. "You ask about the photograph?" The widow looked up. "Yes." The older man exchanged a look with his partner. "You won't get answers from Eli." "Why not?" "Because he still thinks silence fixes things." The second man laughed bitterly. "Silence built half the problems around here." The widow leaned against a fence post. "What happened to his wife?" Both men hesitated. The first one finally spoke. "She disappeared." "Just disappeared?" "No." "What do you mean?" She started asking questions. "Questions about what?" The second ranch hand lowered his voice. "Land." The widow waited. "Keep talking. Some powerful families been taking land for years." "Legally?" "Depends who you ask." The first ranch hand spat into the dirt. She accused people nobody was supposed to accuse. Who? Folks connected to the governor's office. The widow frowned. That's serious. Exactly. What happened after she spoke up? The men exchanged another look. Then came the answer. She vanished. The widow felt something tighten inside her chest. Was there an investigation? The older man laughed. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't. Sheriff said he looked into it and nothing. The second man shook his head. Nothing ever came from it. The widow stood quietly. The conversation felt familiar, too familiar. She remembered standing outside the sheriff's office after her husband died. She remembered asking questions, demanding answers, getting none. Accident. That's what they called it, a fall, a mistake. Case closed. Every question she asked had disappeared into paperwork and silence, just like Eli's wife, just like this ranch, just like that photograph. The widow returned to work, but the stories stayed with her. By afternoon, she found Eli repairing a section of fence alone. She walked over. You knew nobody believed the investigation. Eli kept hammering. You talked to the ranch hands. Yes, they talk too much. No, you talk too little. The hammer stopped. For a moment he simply stared at the fence. Then he spoke. Nothing came from asking questions. That doesn't mean you stop asking. It does when people disappear. The widow looked at him carefully. The anger she first saw at the photograph was gone. What remained looked closer to exhaustion. You loved her. Yes. You still do. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. The widow nodded slowly. I understand that. Ellie glanced at her. For the first time, they seemed less like strangers. Not friends, not allies. Just two people carrying losses that refused to stay buried. That night, the ranch grew unusually quiet. Wind moved across the fields. The house settled around them. The widow lay awake staring at the ceiling. Sleep never came easily anymore. Not after the well. Not after finding her husband broken at the bottom of it. Eventually, she gave up and sat beside the window. That was when she heard it. A sound, faint, distant, almost human. She stood, listened. The sound came again, a whisper, then silence. The next morning she mentioned it during breakfast. Ruth immediately looked down. Ellie's expression changed. What sound? Someone talking. No. Yes. Probably wind. Ruth finally spoke. It happens. Ellie turned sharply. Ruth, the girl, shrank back. But it does. Enough! The widow leaned forward. What happens? Ruth hesitated, then whispered, The well talks. The room became still. What well? The old one. Behind the ranch? Ruth nodded. The widow remembered seeing it in the distance, old stone walls, wooden cover, forgotten. People whisper there at night. Eli stood immediately. That's enough. Ruth fell silent. The widow looked between them. What's wrong with the well? Nothing. Then why does everyone act strange about it? Because you're asking questions again. That isn't an answer. No, he grabbed his hat, then paused beside the door. His voice came out harder than before. Stay away from that well. Why? Because I said so. That's not good enough. It is for now. Then he left. The day passed slowly. The warning stayed in her mind. So did Ruth's words, the well talks. As darkness settled across the ranch, curiosity finally won. The widow stepped outside alone. The field stretched quietly around her. The old well stood beyond the barn waiting. She walked toward it. Each step felt heavier than it should have. The closer she came, the quieter the ranch became. No cattle sounds. No voices, only darkness. She stopped beside the stone rim. Nothing moved, nothing spoke. For several seconds she felt foolish. Then she heard it. A voice low, weak. Impossible. Her entire body froze. The whisper drifted upward from the darkness below. A voice she knew better than her own. A voice that should have been dead. Her husband's voice. Calling her name from inside the well. Her husband's voice calling her name from inside the well. The widow froze beside the stone rim. Every muscle in her body locked in place. The sound had been clear, not distant, not imagined. clear enough to make her heart stumble. She waited. Nothing came. Only silence. The darkness below looked endless. "Thomas?" Her voice barely escaped her throat. No answer. She stepped closer. The old stones felt cold beneath her hands. She leaned over the opening and stared down. Nothing moved, no light, no shape, no man waiting below. Yet she knew what she had heard. The voice belonged to her husband. The same rough voice that used to wake her before sunrise, the same voice that vanished forever inside another well months earlier. She stayed there for several minutes listening, watching, waiting. Nothing happened. Eventually, she forced herself to step back. The ranch stood quiet behind her. No witnesses, no proof, only the memory of a whisper. The next morning, she said nothing about it, not to Eli, not to Ruth, not to anyone. Part of her feared they would think she was losing her mind. Another part feared they would believe her. After breakfast, she found herself walking back toward the well. She told herself she only wanted answers. The truth felt different. She wanted to hear the voice again. Sunlight revealed details hidden during the night. The stones were older than she first realized. Many carried scratches and markings. Names, dates, initials, some nearly worn away. She ran her fingers across them. Most meant nothing. Then she stopped. 2 letters. E.M. The carving looked deliberate, fresh compared to the others. Her stomach tightened. Eli Morgan, his wife, would have carried the same initials. She touched the mark carefully. Emily. The name slipped from her mouth before she realized it. One of the ranch hands had mentioned it days earlier. Emily Morgan, the missing wife. The widow kept searching. More scratches, more names. Then another set of initials appeared lower on the stone. T.H. Her breath caught Thomas Hale, her husband. The initials matched exactly. She knew his handwriting, his carving style, his habits. These marks belonged to him. The widow stepped backward. The world suddenly felt wrong. Her husband and Eli's missing wife. Both connected to the same well. Both somehow linked before either tragedy happened. How? The question echoed through her head. She never heard footsteps approaching. Stay away from that well. The voice made her turn sharply. The sheriff stood several yards away. Hat low, fall unreadable. The widow folded her arms. Why? Because trouble starts there. Sounds like trouble ended there, too. The sheriff's jaw tightened. You should go back to the house. You should answer my questions. I don't owe you answers. No, just the truth. For a moment, neither spoke. The sheriff glanced toward the initials. His expression changed. Only slightly. But she noticed. You know something. No. You looked at those carvings. No. That's another lie. The sheriff sighed heavily. Some things stay buried for a reason. The widow stepped closer. That's exactly what people told me after Thomas died. The sheriff looked away. You should let the past rest. The past keeps talking. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward town. The widow watched him leave. His warning only deepened her suspicions. That night sleep finally came. But peace did not. She found herself standing beside the well again. Only this time she wasn't alone. People filled the darkness below. Dozens of them, men, women, children, all standing shoulder to shoulder inside the well. All staring upward. None speaking, none blinking. The widow searched their faces. Some looked familiar. Others did not. Then she saw Thomas among them. Beside him stood a woman she had never met, dark hair, calm eyes. Emily. She somehow knew it was Emily, the missing wife. Neither moved, neither smiled. They only stared. The widow woke suddenly. Her sheets were soaked with sweat. Morning light filled the room. But the dream stayed with her. The next few days passed uneasily. Work continued. Repairs continued. Yet every conversation seemed to circle back toward missing people and unanswered questions. One afternoon, the widow sat beside several ranch workers during lunch. The subject returned once again, the well. An older worker shook his head. My grandfather used to talk about that place. What did he say? The widow asked. He said land fights always ended near it. Another worker nodded. Not just land fights. The widow waited. Dense. The word landed heavily. What kind of deaths? The worker shrugged. The kind nobody solved. Silence followed. Then another man spoke. Funny thing is, the same family always came out ahead afterward. The widow looked up. What family? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the oldest man lowered his voice. You know which one? The governor's family? Nobody needed to say the name. Everyone understood. The widow felt a chill. How many deaths? Too many. Investigations? The men laughed bitterly. No. Witnesses disappeared. Records vanished. Land changed hands. Each answer sounded worse than the last. The widow stared toward the distant well. The old stones seemed smaller from here, yet somehow more dangerous. Not because of ghosts, because of people. Because secrets lasted longer than bodies. The well stood at the center of every story. A place where truth entered and never returned. That evening clouds gathered overhead. The ranch felt unusually still. The widow walked toward the well again, despite promising herself she wouldn't. Questions pulled her forward. The same questions nobody wanted answered. She knelt beside the stone rim. The initials remained where she had left them. EMTH Emily Thomas. The connection felt impossible. Yet it existed. She pressed her hand against the rough surface. Something shifted beneath her fingers. A loose stone. The widow frowned. Carefully, she pushed against it. The rock moved slightly. Enough to reveal a narrow gap. Her pulse quickened. She worked the stone free inch by inch. Behind it sat a small hidden space. Dark, forgotten waiting. The widow reached inside. Her fingers touched paper. Old paper, folded tightly. Her breath stopped. Slowly, she pulled it free. A weathered letter emerged from the darkness. He between the stones for years. And someone had wanted very badly to make sure nobody ever found it. A weathered letter emerged from the darkness. And someone had wanted very badly to make sure nobody ever found it. The widow stared at the folded paper in her hands. The edges were yellow with age. Dirt stained the corners. The handwriting on the front was faded but still visible. Emily, her pulse quickened. She looked around the empty ranch yard. Nobody was watching. At least nobody she could see. Carefully, she unfolded the pages. The first lines were difficult to read. Years of moisture had damaged parts of the ink. But enough remained. She recognized fear immediately. Not from the words, from the way they were written. Fast, urgent. Desperate, the widow continued reading. Emily wrote about land records, bapattery deeds, threats, families being forced away from land they had owned for generations. Some sold after intimidation. Others vanished after refusing. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Men connected to the governor's family. Men with power. Men nobody challenged. The widow's hands trembled slightly. Then she reached a line that stopped her completely. Thomas Hale, her husband's name, written clearly. Written deliberately. She read it again. Then again, Thomas Hale has copies of the records. If something happens to me, he knows where to look. The widow felt the air leave her lungs. Thomas, her husband, connected to Emily. Connected to the governor's family. Connected to the well. Everything suddenly felt larger than grief. Larger than coincidence. She folded the letter and hurried back toward the house. Ellie was repairing a saddle on the porch when she arrived. You need to read this. He looked up. What is it? Read it. Something in her voice made him stand immediately. They entered the house. The widow handed him the pages. At first, he read silently. Then his expression changed, confusion. Shock, pain. His hands tightened around the paper. The room felt smaller with every second. Finally, he lowered the letter. This can't be real. It is. Then she knew your husband. And he knew something that got him killed. Neither spoke for a moment. The truth settled heavily between them. Ellie looked back at the pages. His eyes moved across Emily's handwriting. Across words written by someone he had loved, someone he never stopped searching for. She was trying to tell someone. Yes, she knew she was in danger. Yes. Ellie sat slowly. For the first time, the widow saw his defenses crack completely. Not anger, not stubbornness. Grief, fong and old, the kind that never leaves. She never told me. She probably thought she was protecting you. That worked out well. The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. The widow understood. She had spoken those same words after Thomas died. Across the room, a floorboard creaked. Both turned. Ruth stood in the doorway, silent, listening. The little girl looked from Eli to the widow, then to the letter. "What happened?" Nobody answered. "What is it?" Eli swallowed. "Nothing." Ruth shook her head. "That's a lie." The widow almost smiled. The girl sounded exactly like her father. Ruth stepped closer. "Is it about Mom?" Silence answered her. The child's face slowly changed. Fear appeared first. Then understanding, small pieces at a time. She didn't leave. The statement wasn't a question. Nobody corrected her. Ruth lowered her eyes. The room felt colder. That evening, nobody ate much dinner. Nobody spoke much either. The letter sat folded on the table like another person sharing the meal. After dark, the widow noticed Eli reading it again. Then once more. Each time searching for something he missed, or something he wished wasn't there. The next morning, trouble arrived. The sheriff appeared before sunrise. The widow saw him riding toward the ranch from the kitchen window. Eli stepped outside first. The sheriff dismounted. Neither man smiled. The widow joined them on the porch. The sheriff's eyes immediately found the letter in her hands. His expression hardened. "You found something." "Yes, you should have brought it to me." "Why?" The sheriff looked away briefly, then back. "Because things are going to get worse now. You already knew. I knew rumors. You knew more than rumors." The sheriff said nothing. That silence became its own answer. "How did you hear about it?" the widow asked. The sheriff hesitated. "News travels. Fast, too fast." His face darkened. Then he looked toward the road. "They know too." "Who?" The sheriff didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. The governor's people, the same names from the letter, the same names from the stories. The same names nobody challenged. By afternoon, unfamiliar riders appeared in town. The widow noticed them while collecting supplies, clean clothes, expensive horses, watchful eyes. They asked questions without asking questions. They lingered near stores, near offices, near anyone connected to the ranch. The pressure spread quietly, like smoke. By evening, even neighbors seemed nervous. Conversation stopped when she approached. Dior's closed sooner. People looked over their shoulders. When the widow returned to the ranch, Eli waited outside. "You still can leave." "No. You should think about it." "I have. This isn't your fight." She stared at him. "Thomas is in that letter. That doesn't change anything." "It changes everything." Ellie looked exhausted. "You don't know what these people can do." "Actually, I do." The words landed harder than she expected because they were true. Her husband was dead. Her home was gone. Her future had been auctioned away. Fear had already taken enough. Ellie studied her face. "You really won't leave?" "No." "Why not?" The widow looked toward the distant well, toward the darkness gathering around it, toward the secrets hidden beneath stone and silence. Then she answered, "Because dead people finally started talking." Neither spoke after that. Night settled across the ranch. The house eventually grew quiet. Hours passed. The widow couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. Shortly after midnight, she rose from bed and crossed to the window. At first, she saw only darkness. Then she noticed movement, tiny lights. One, then another, then several more. They appeared near the old well. Moving slowly through the night, circling it, watching it, waiting. And whoever carried those lights did not want to be seen. Tiny lights moved around the old well. One, then another, then several more. They drifted through the darkness like silent watchers. The widow stood at the window, her heart beating harder with each passing second. Whoever carried those lanterns stayed beyond clear sight. Their faces remained hidden. She hurried from her room. Moments later, Eli met her in the hallway. "You see them too?" "Yes. The answer came instantly. Neither wasted time. They grabbed lanterns of their own and stepped into the night. The lights near the well stopped moving, as if the strangers knew they were coming. Ely quickened his pace. The widow followed. By the time they reached the edge of the field, shadows were already pulling away. "Who's there?" Ely shouted. No answer, only horses. The sudden sound of hooves broke the silence. Several riders emerged from the darkness and raced toward the distant road. "Stop!" Ely ran after them. The widow followed for several steps before realizing it was useless. The riders disappeared into the night, gone, leaving only dust and questions behind. The next morning revealed another message. 3 fence posts near the southern pasture had been burned black. Not enough damage to destroy the fence. Just enough to send a warning. The widow stared at the charred wood. "Someone wants us afraid." Ellie nodded. They succeeded. She looked at him. "Are you?" "Yes." The honesty surprised her. It would not have a week earlier. Something was changing in him. Not his fear, his willingness to admit it. The attacks continued. 2 days later, a neighbor's crops were destroyed overnight. Rows of healthy plants flattened into the dirt. No footprints, no witnesses. Only damage. The neighbor arrived at the ranch furious. "They think we'll stay quiet." Ellie crossed his arms. "Will you?" The man hesitated, then looked away. The answer hurt more than words. Fear still ruled the town. Fear still protected powerful people. Fear still kept mouths closed. That evening, Ruth found the widow sitting on the porch. The girl climbed onto the step beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Ruth finally broke the silence. "Are you scared?" The widow looked out toward the fields. Every reason to be afraid stood somewhere beyond them. "Yes, every day, every day." Ruth studied her. "Then why keep going?" The widow thought about Thomas, about Emily, about the letter hidden in stone. Then she answered, "Because fear isn't the same thing as surrender." Ruth nodded slowly, as though she wanted to remember those words forever. The next morning, the widow traveled into town. Not for supplies, for answers. The stories were growing larger than one ranch, larger than one family. If Emily had been telling the truth, other people had suffered too. She started with a woman whose husband had lost his farm years earlier. The widow expected hesitation. Instead, she received relief, as if someone had finally asked the right question. "They threatened us." "Who?" "Men working for powerful families." "What happened?" "We sold." "Why?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Because my husband was beaten." The widow listened. Then she visited another family, then another. The stories changed. The pattern did not. Threats, pressure, disappearing paperwork, sudden deaths, lost property, always the same result. Someone else gained the land. Someone else gained power. Word spread quickly. Soon women began gathering wherever the widow stopped, around kitchen tables, inside barns, beside wells, on front porches. The conversations lasted for hours. People who had stayed silent for years finally spoke. One woman revealed her father had vanished after refusing to sign away grazing rights. Another described a suspicious fire. Another remembered witnessing threats as a child. Each story sounded different. Each story felt connected. The widow noticed something else. Many of the women carried the same expression, not anger, exhaustion. The kind that comes from holding painful truths alone. For the first time, they weren't alone anymore. The buried voices were rising, and once spoken aloud, they became harder to bury again. Back at the ranch, Ely listened carefully to every story she brought home. At first, he only listened. Then he started asking questions, then taking notes, then making visits himself. The widow noticed the change immediately. One evening, she found him sorting papers across the kitchen table. "You've been busy." "Yes, looking for evidence?" "Yes, you think we'll find it?" "I think we already have." He held up the letter. For a moment, his eyes rested on Emily's handwriting, not with despair, with purpose. The widow understood. Grief had stopped controlling him, not completely, but enough. The man who spent years hiding from old wounds was beginning to fight back. Ruth noticed it too. He smiles more. The widow looked toward Eli. The smile was small, rare, but real. Yes, I forgot he could. The answer broke something inside her. Children should never have to forget things like that. Days passed. The intimidation continued. Another fence burned. A barn window shattered. Anonymous notes appeared. Leave. Stop digging. Stay quiet. Nobody obeyed, not anymore. One afternoon, an elderly woman arrived unexpectedly at the ranch. The widow recognized her from town. She lived alone beyond the river. People rarely saw her. She carried a small wooden box against her chest. Evie locked it. Important, he stepped forward. "Can we help you?" The woman looked past him directly at the widow. "I heard you found Emily's letter." The widow nodded, the woman's eyes filled with sadness. "I hoped someone would." She carefully extended the box. "What is it?" The woman glanced toward the distant road, then toward the well, then back again. Something they spent years trying to hide. The widow accepted the box. The lock remained sealed. The wood felt old beneath her fingers. "What's inside?" The elderly woman swallowed hard. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Proof!" And suddenly every eye in the yard fixed on the locked box connected to the governor's family. And suddenly every eye in the yard fixed on the locked box connected to the governor's family. Nobody spoke. The elderly woman stepped back. "You keep it safe. Where did you get this?" the widow asked. "My husband kept it." "Why?" "Because he was afraid." The answer felt familiar. Before anyone could ask another question, the woman turned and walked away. The widow looked at Eli. Ellie looked at the box. Ruth stared at it too. Whatever rested inside had survived years of silence. Now it sat in their hands waiting. They carried it into the house. The box was placed at the center of the kitchen table. Eli searched through a drawer and found an old tool. The lock resisted at first, then finally snapped. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Nobody moved immediately. The widow lifted the lid. Inside sat stacks of papers, old documents, letters. Official seals. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. Land deeds filled one bundle. Botris transferred under suspicious circumstances. Families forced out. Signatures gathered through threats. Names repeated over and over. The same powerful names, the same connected families, the same people Emily had warned about. Beneath the deeds rested several county badges, deputy badges, old law enforcement insignias. The widow frowned. "Why would these be here?" Ellie examined one. The metal looked damaged, discarded, high. Another bundle revealed signed statements, witness accounts, accusations, descriptions of threats and violence. Reports that never reached court. Reports that vanished. The widow slowly shook her head. "This goes back years." "Decades," Eli said. The room grew quiet. Every page pushed the corruption farther into the past. This wasn't one crime, it was a system, a machine built slowly over generations. Ruth stood beside the table. "What happens now?" Nobody answered. The truth felt dangerous enough inside the house. Outside, it could become deadly. Late that afternoon, the sheriff arrived. Agan. The moment he stepped onto the porch, the widow knew he already suspected something. Ellie let him inside. The sheriff saw the open box. His face darkened immediately. "You found more?" "Yes." The sheriff stared at the papers. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the widow crossed her arms. "You knew. Some of it. Not enough. More than I wanted." The widow stepped closer. "You think I'm supposed to feel sorry for you?" "No." "Good." The sheriff nodded slowly. "You think I'm the villain, aren't you?" The sheriff looked at the floor. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he answered quietly. "Sometimes surviving looks the same." The words hung in the room. Not an excuse, not a defense. Just a confession. The widow studied him carefully. For the first time she noticed how tired he looked. Not physically, spiritually. Like a man carrying years of regret. "You tried to stop them once." The sheriff looked up sharply. "How do you know that?" She pointed toward the box. One statement carried his signature, an old report, years old, ignored, buried. The sheriff stared at it. I was younger. What happened? I failed. The answer came immediately. No hesitation, no pride, only shame. I thought evidence would matter. And it disappeared. You quit. No. The sheriff swallowed hard. They threatened my family. Silence followed. They threatened everyone. Yes, you still looked away. Yes. The honesty made the room feel uncomfortable because it sounded real. The sheriff wasn't innocent. But neither was he the monster she expected. Fear had broken him long before it reached anyone else. I should have done more, he said. The widow believed him. That made everything harder. After he left, the house remained quiet. Each person seemed trapped inside private thoughts. The widow spent hours reading through documents, names, dates, property transfers, witnesses, victims. The list felt endless. Then Ruth found something. The girl sat near the window examining a stack of papers nobody had checked carefully. Suddenly her face turned pale. Dad, Ellie looked up. What is it? Ruth held out a folded statement. Her hands were shaking. The widow crossed the room quickly. What did you find? Ruth couldn't answer. She simply pointed. Ellie took the paper. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. Everything inside him seemed to collapse at once. The widow took the document and read it herself. A witness statement, years old, never filed, never investigated. Emily Morgan had been seen arguing with several men connected to the governor's family. Days later, a second witness reported hearing a gunshot near abandoned land outside town. A third statement followed. Someone described seeing men carrying a body. A woman's body. Emily's body. The room became completely silent. The widow looked at Eli. His face had lost all color. She wasn't missing. Nobody answered. The paper already had. Emily never vanished. Emily was murdered. Ruth began crying quietly. The sound filled the room. Ellie remained motionless. The widow had seen grief before, lived inside it. This looked different. This was grief discovering something worse than death. The lies surrounding it, years stolen, years searching, years hoping. Gone. Finally, Eli spoke. I should have found her. The widow moved closer. You were meant to. Then why didn't I? His voice cracked. For the first time, she heard the pain beneath all his silence. Because they made sure you couldn't. The answer broke him. Eli lowered his head. The room stood still around him. No words could repair that wound. No justice could return those years. All the widow could do was stand beside him. And she did. As evening settled outside, they organized the evidence carefully. The box, the letter, the witness statements. Everything. The truth was finally taking shape, dangerously clearly. Then came the sound of horses, several of them, approaching fast. Everyone looked toward the window. Riders entered the yard, not neighbors. Not friends. Men wearing clean coats and hard expressions. One carried official papers. The widow felt dread immediately. The riders stopped in front of the house. The lead man dismounted. Without waiting for permission, he climbed the porch steps. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Nobody moved. The knock came again, harder. Finally, Eli opened the door. The stranger handed him a folded document. Official notice. Eli unfolded it. His expression darkened. The widow already knew, even before reading it herself. The governor's people had made their move. And the paper in Eli's hands carried an eviction order demanding the ranch be surrendered immediately. The governor's people had made their move, and the paper in Eli's hands carried an eviction order demanding the ranch be surrendered immediately. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The stranger remained on the porch, calm and confident, as if the outcome had already been decided. Ellie folded the document carefully. We're not leaving. The man smiled. You don't have a choice. We'll see. The stranger glanced toward the house. Toward Ruth, toward the widow, then back to Eli. You should think carefully. The threat did not need explanation. Everyone heard it. The rider turned and left. The others followed. Their horses disappeared down the road, leaving silence behind. The widow looked at Eli. "What now?" Eli stared at the paper, then at the evidence spread across the table. "Now we fight." Word spread quickly, faster than anyone expected. Within 2 days, neighboring ranch families began arriving. Some came on horseback, others by wagon. A few walked. Men and women gathered in the yard carrying stories, documents, and fears they had hidden for years. The widow watched from the porch. Weeks earlier, these people barely spoke above whispers. Now they stood together, not because they were fearless, because they were tired. One rancher held up a notice similar to Eli's. "They sent me one too." Another nodded. "Me too." A woman stepped forward. "They think they can scare us one family at a time." The widow looked across the crowd. The same faces she had visited, the same people who had finally spoken. Nobody wanted to leave, nobody moved. The governor's people noticed. The pressure grew immediately. Another fence burned. More livestock disappeared. Anonymous threats appeared nailed to gates. One morning, the word "coward" was painted across a barn wall. The intimidation no longer hid in shadows. It stood in the open, just like the truth. Then came the fire. It started shortly before dawn. The widow woke to shouting. She rushed outside. Orange light filled the darkness. The main barn was burning. Flames climbed the walls. Smoke rolled into the sky. "Get water! Move the horses! Open the gates!" People ran in every direction. Ellie sprinted toward the barn. The widow followed. Inside, frightened animals kicked against their stalls. The heat felt unbearable. A horse screamed. The sound cut straight through her. "Over here!" The widow grabbed a latch and pulled. A stall door flew open. 2 horses bolted into the yard. Others followed. Neighbors formed lines carrying buckets. Women hauled water. Children led animals to safety. Nobody waited for instructions. Nobody stood aside. Everyone worked. The widow looked around between bursts of smoke. Something struck her then. The fire had been meant to divide them. Instead, it pulled them together. The flames consumed wood, but they also exposed something stronger: merit. Every person fighting that fire carried a story: a lost farm, a dead relative, a stolen piece of land, years of silence, years of fear. The governor's people burned a barn, but they couldn't burn what brought everyone there. Hours later, the fire finally died. Part of the structure remained standing. Most of it did not. The crowd gathered nearby, covered in soot, exhausted, angry. The widow looked across the faces surrounding her. Nobody seemed willing to leave. A neighbor stepped forward. "What do we do now?" The question hung heavily in the air. Everyone turned toward Eli. Instead, he looked at the widow. Others followed. The attention surprised her. For a moment, she almost stepped back. Then she remembered Thomas. Emily, the well, the letter, all the voices buried for years. She stepped forward. The crowd fell silent. They counted on silence. Nobody interrupted. They counted on people being afraid. Several heads nodded. They counted on families standing alone. The widow looked around slowly. But look around. The crowd did. Neighbors stood beside neighbors. Families beside families. People who once hid now stood together. A rancher raised his hand. "What if they win?" The widow held his gaze. Then they win, standing over people who finally spoke. Silence followed. Then came applause. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. The sound spread through the crowd. Hope felt dangerous. Yet nobody seemed willing to surrender it. That afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. The sheriff. The yard grew tense immediately. People watched carefully. Nobody trusted him. Not completely. Maybe never. The sheriff climbed from his horse carrying several boxes. Heavy boxes, dust-covered boxes. He set them on the ground. Ellie frowned. "What is this?" The sheriff looked at the crowd, then at the widow. "The things I should have handed over years ago." Nobody moved. The sheriff opened one box. Records, reports, witness statements, evidence. More than anyone expected. The widow stared. "You kept all this?" "Yes." "Why?" The sheriff's answer came quietly. Because part of me always hoped I'd find the courage. The crowd remained silent. The sheriff looked around. They buried investigations. He pointed toward the files. They buried complaints. Another box opened. They buried deaths. A third followed. But they didn't bury everything. The widow saw relief move through the crowd, not because justice had arrived, because proof had, finally, a ranch woman stepped forward. "What happens now?" The sheriff answered before anyone else. "We demand hearings." Others nodded immediately. Public hearings, public records. Public questions. The governor's family had spent years operating behind closed doors. Now the doors would be forced open. The days that followed became increasingly tense. Rumors spread through town. Powerful people held private meetings. Strangers appeared more often. The governor's allies looked nervous for the first time. Desperate people made mistakes. Everyone sensed it. Late one evening, the widow found Il sitting alone outside the damaged barn. The remains of blackened beams stood behind him. Neither spoke for a while. The fire's scars remained visible everywhere. Finally, Eli broke the silence. "You changed this place." "No." "You did." She shook her head. "People changed themselves. They needed someone to start." The widow looked toward the house, toward Ruth's window, toward the ranch she never intended to call home. "I was just angry." Ellie smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what hope looks like sometimes." The widow almost laughed. Maybe it did. Morning arrived. The evidence was packed carefully into wagons, the letter, the records, the statements, the box. Every piece of truth they possessed. Families gathered again. This time with purpose. Nobody stayed behind. Nobody hid. The sheriff joined them. So did ranchers, widows' workers, mothers, fathers' children. The widow climbed into a wagon beside Eli. Ahead stood the road leading into town. Beyond it waited the courthouse. And for the first time in years, townspeople marched toward it together, carrying evidence no one could ignore. And for the first time in years, townspeople marched toward it together, carrying evidence no one could ignore. The courthouse steps filled before noon. Wagons lined the street. Families crowded the sidewalks. Workers stood beside ranchers. Widows stood beside deputies. People who had spent years avoiding attention now gathered in full view of the town. The widow stepped down from the wagon, carrying Emily's letter. Eli carried the locked box. The sheriff walked behind them, holding old records. Nobody spoke much. The evidence spoke loudly enough. Officials waited at the courthouse entrance. Nervous faces, forced smiles. Men accustomed to control, one county administrator stepped forward. "This matter should be reviewed privately." "No," the widow said. The crowd agreed immediately. "This isn't the proper process." "Neither was murder," someone shouted. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The administrator's confidence weakened. Another official raised his hands. "You're making accusations." The sheriff stepped forward. "No." He placed a stack of reports on the courthouse steps. "We're presenting evidence." Silence followed. People pushed closer. The papers began changing hands. Witness statements. Prairie records signed complaints. Ignored investigations. The truth moved through the crowd one page at a time. Every document carried another piece of the story. Every page made denial harder. By afternoon, the courthouse had lost control of the situation. Questions came from everywhere. Families identified names. Witnesses came forward. People who once stayed silent started talking openly. The governor's allies looked increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, miles away at the ranch, another search had begun. Several workers returned to the old well. The widow had not wanted to leave it unattended. Too many secrets lived there. Before leaving town, she asked trusted neighbors to continue examining the area. Now they dug carefully around the stone structure, removing loose rock, checking hidden spaces, looking for anything connected to the evidence. At first, they found nothing. Then one worker noticed a gap beneath the foundation stones. A narrow opening, almost invisible. The discovery spread quickly. More hands joined the effort. Stone after stone came free, the opening widened. What waited beneath would change everything. Back at the courthouse, news traveled by rider. A horse arrived at full speed. Dust covered both animal and rider. The man jumped down immediately. "You need to come." The urgency in his voice silenced everyone. The widow stepped forward. "What happened?" "We found something." The ride back to the ranch felt endless. Dozens of people followed. The sheriff came too. By the time they arrived, the area around the well was crowded. Workers stood quietly. Nobody looked relieved. Nobody looked surprised. Only haunted. The widow pushed through the gathering. Then she saw it, the hidden chamber built beneath the well, large enough to conceal terrible things. The opening descended into darkness. A ladder had already been lowered. Lanterns glowed below. The sheriff stared at the chamber, his face turned pale. Dear God! The widow understood immediately. The well had never been just a well. It had been a grave, a hiding place, a vault for crimes nobody wanted discovered. Workers slowly carried evidence upward, old belongings, clothing, personal items. Fragments of lives. Then came something worse. Human remains. The crowd fell silent. No crying, no shouting. Only stunned silence. One set after another emerged from the darkness. Woman. People erased from records and memory. People whose disappearances had never been solved. People connected to land disputes. People connected to resistance. The truth rose from beneath the earth, and it refused to stay buried any longer. The widow looked at Eli. His face had gone completely still. Then workers uncovered a necklace, worn, recognizable. Eli stared at it. His breathing changed. The sheriff lowered his eyes. Nobody needed confirmation. Ellie already knew. Emily had been there, all along, not missing, not lost. Buried, the years of uncertainty ended in a single terrible moment. Ruth began crying quietly beside the widow. The widow wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Neither spoke. Words felt useless. More remains followed. More names. More stories. The chamber beneath the well became a map of corruption stretching across generations. Every body told the same story. Someone resisted. Someone disappeared. Someone powerful benefited afterward. The psychological weight of it settled over everyone present. The well had swallowed truths for decades. Now it gave them back, not gently, not mercifully, completely. As news spread, investigators from outside the region arrived. Questions multiplied, witnesses stepped forward. Matched remains. Timelines connected. The governor's family's influence began collapsing under its own weight. By evening, a public gathering formed near the courthouse once more. This time, nobody could dismiss the evidence. The sheriff stood before the crowd. Thousands of eyes seemed fixed on him. For years he avoided this moment. Now there was nowhere left to hide. He removed his hat. His hands trembled slightly. I looked away. A citizen stepped forward. Why? The sheriff swallowed hard. Because I was afraid. The answer echoed through the crowd, not dramatic, not heroic, just honest. Another voice called out, "And now?" The sheriff lifted his eyes. For the first time, the widow saw certainty there. "Now I'm more afraid of what happens if I stay silent." The crowd remained still. Then people began nodding, not forgiveness, understanding. The difference mattered. Later that night, another discovery emerged from the evidence. A collection of documents recovered from the chamber included copies of records Emily mentioned in her letter. Thomas Hale's name appeared repeatedly. The widow read every page herself. Each line brought painful clarity. Thomas had helped gather evidence. Thomas had copied records. Thomas had met secretly with Emily. Thomas had planned to expose everything. Then one final statement appeared, sign dated, specific. A witness described seeing Thomas confronted by men connected to the governor's network shortly before his death. The report included details never released publicly. Details impossible to invent. The widow read it twice. Then a third time. There could be no doubt Thomas had not fallen accidentally. He had been murdered. The certainty hurt, yet strangely it also brought peace. For months she chased uncertainty, questions, rumors, possibilities. Now she finally possessed the truth. The truth was cruel, but it was real. She closed her eyes not to escape grief, to release it. Thomas died trying to do the right thing. Emily died doing the same. Neither disappeared without purpose. Their voices survived, that mattered. By the following morning, arrests had begun. Several officials were removed from office. Associates connected to the governor's family were taken into custody. Investigations expanded rapidly. The system that once seemed untouchable started breaking apart, not because one person exposed it, because many finally spoke. As sunset approached, the crowd gradually dispersed. The widow returned to the well alone. The opening remained exposed. Lantern light flickered below. Chamber no longer felt mysterious. Only sad, years of silence had ended there. Years of suffering had surfaced there. She stepped closer to the edge. The darkness waited beneath her, not calling, not whispering, just existing. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt no fear standing beside it, no confusion, no desperate questions. Understanding, the widow stood beside the opened well at sunset, looking into its darkness one final time. The widow stood beside the opened well at sunset, looking into its darkness one final time. The wind moved softly across the ranch. The crowd had gone, the workers had gone. Even the investigators had left for the evening. Only the widow remained. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around a small gold ring, Thomas's wedding ring. The same ring she had carried since the day they buried him. For months she could not let it go. The ring felt like the last piece of him she still controlled. Now she looked down into the darkness below, not with fear. Not with anger. With acceptance, slowly she opened her hand. The ring caught the last light of the setting sun. Then it disappeared into the well. The faint sound of metal touching stone echoed upward. The widow closed her eyes. "You can rest now." For the first time in a very long time, she felt lighter. The grief remained, it always would. But grief no longer owned every corner of her life. The truth had finally been found. The lies had finally been broken. And Thomas's voice no longer seemed trapped inside the darkness. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The community began rebuilding. Not quickly, not perfectly, but honestly. Land stolen through intimidation was returned to families whenever records allowed it. Property disputes were reopened. Old claims were reviewed. For the first time in years, ordinary people walked into county offices without lowering their eyes. The changes were small at first. Then they grew. Files that had stood abandoned were planted again. Fences were repaired. Homes filled with people once forced away. Everywhere the widow looked, she saw movement replacing fear. One morning a wagon arrived, carrying several families returning to their old property. Children jumped down first, laughing, running. Their parents stood silently beside the road. Some cried, some simply stared. The widow understood. Home had always been more than land. It was memory. And now those memories had a place to live again. The sheriff changed too. He spent weeks helping investigators and turning over every document he still possessed. Eventually he arrived at the ranch carrying only a single box. The widow found him standing on the porch. Leaving? Yes. Where? Not sure. He looked older than when she first met him. Lighter too. The burden of silence was gone. "What happens now?" she asked. The sheriff managed a small smile. "I try being a better man somewhere else." He handed over his badge, then walked away. No ceremony, no applause. Just a man finally choosing honesty over fear. The ranch slowly healed as well. New workers arrived, more livestock filled the pastures. The damaged barn was rebuilt board by board. The empty feeling inside the house began fading. Most surprising of all was Ruth. The little girl who once moved through rooms like a shadow started changing. The widow noticed it gradually, longer conversations. More questions, small smiles. Then one afternoon it happened. A horse escaped a corral and raced through the yard carrying a stolen sack of feed. The sight was ridiculous. The horse seemed proud of itself. Ruth watched it run, then laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a quiet laugh, a real one, bright, free. The sound stopped everyone. Ellie looked up from his work. The widow froze. Even Ruth seemed surprised by it. Then she laughed again and again. The ranch suddenly felt different, as if a locked door had finally opened. One evening, Eli entered the house carrying an old wooden frame. The widow recognized it immediately. The burned photograph, he placed it on the table. Found something. What? Without speaking, Eli handed her another photograph, a copy undamaged, preserved by a distant relative years earlier. The widow studied it carefully. The missing face was finally visible. Emily stood beside Eli, one arm around young Ruth, smiling. Alive, wool. Ruth moved closer. Tears filled her eyes. "That's Mom, yes." Eli eats quietly. The girl touched the photograph carefully, as though afraid it might disappear. But it didn't. The damaged picture remained nearby, the burned one, the broken one, the symbol of loss. Now it sat beside the restored image, past and present together, pain and healing together, neither erased, neither forgotten. Weeks later, Eli asked the widow to walk with him through the ranch. The fields stretched green around them, livestock grazed peacefully, workers repaired a distant fence. The ranch no longer felt haunted, it felt alive. They stopped near the rebuilt barn. Eli handed her a folded document. She opened it, ownership papers. Partial ownership. The widow looked up immediately. "What is this, the ranch?" She stared at him. "No, yes, I can't take this. You already earned it." The widow shook her head. "I was bought at an auction." Ellie's expression softened. "Nobody owns you. I know. Good." For a moment, neither spoke. The years ahead suddenly seemed uncertain, not frightening, simply unwritten. The widow folded the papers carefully. "What happens now?" Ellie looked across the ranch, then toward Ruth playing in the yard. Finally back at her. "Whatever we choose." Months later, the old well changed forever. Workers sealed the chamber, stone by stone, carefully, respectfully. No secrets remained beneath it anymore, only memory. A memorial was built around the site. Names were carved into polished stone. Every victim identified. Every victim remembered. The community gathered on the evening it was completed. Families arrived carrying lanterns. Children carried flowers. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder. Nobody rushed. Nobody hid. The widow looked around and saw faces that once seemed defeated. Now they looked different. Not because life had become easy. Because hope had returned. One by one lanterns were lit. Soft lights spread across the gathering. The old well stood at the center, not as a place of fear, as a place of remembrance. Ruth appeared beside the widow. Without speaking, she slipped her hand into hers. The widow squeezed gently. The little girl looked up. "You gave us hope." The widow smiled. "No," Ruth frowned. "Then what was it?" The widow looked across the crowd, at the lanterns, at the families, at Eli, at the names carved into stone. Then she answered, "I reminded you it was still here." Ruth smiled. The lanterns rose slowly into the night, dozens of lights drifting upward together. Nobody spoke for a while. The silence that settled over the gathering felt familiar. But it wasn't the same silence that once haunted the ranch. It wasn't built from fear. It wasn't built from secrets. It wasn't built from grief. This silence carried peace. The widow stood with Eli and Ruth beside the memorial well, watching lantern lights rise into the darkness above, carrying memory without being trapped by it.